Now I want to bring up a current PhD fiction student, Scott Ray, to do a proper introduction for our visitor.
Thanks, Corey. I first met Padma Viswanathan in the summer before she was to be my professor in the creative writing program at the University of Arkansas. I was in front of her in line at the Dixon Street Bookshop, a sprawling used bookstore in Fayetteville, just down the street from the English building. After we introduced ourselves, the first question she asked me was what book I had chosen. It was Death in Venice. I still remember she said, "Oh yes, very interesting, problematic." That fall, I took Padma's Craft of the Short Story class where I had read, I think, only one of the stories we discussed before, something unusual and refreshing in a graduate writing course. When I began the class, I thought about craft like a contractor, where to put down the floors of a story, where to run the pipes and the wires. In Padma's class, we talked about craft like philosophers of architecture. I learned that craft wasn't just putting things together. Crafting stories was about the ideas that make stories take hold in your mind and create some real new thing. In her second novel, The Ever After of Ashwin Rao, which I believe she's reading from today, she demonstrates this devotion to the cerebral. It's a book that contemplates terrorism, family, time, grief, faith, how grief and faith relate, how faith and grief relate. It's a book about an ununderstandable tragedy, something unfortunately very relevant today, and the desire to understand something about it anyway. Padma is also the author of the novel The Toss of a Lemon, which was published in 8 countries and is a bestseller in 3. It was the finalist for the Commonwealth Regional First Book Prize, the Amazon.Canada First Novel Prize, and the Penn Center USA Fiction Prize. Her second novel, The Ever After of Ashwin Rao, has been published in Canada, the US, India, and Australia. In Canada, it was shortlisted for the Scotiabank Giller Prize and was a national bestseller. Padma's short fiction appears in various journals. Most recently, her story, Better Protect America, was published online in Granta. Another story, Transitory Cities, won the 2006 Boston Review Short Story Contest. Her plays include House of Sacred Cows and Disco Does Not Suck. She has published many personal essays, cultural journalism, and reviews. She recently finished working on a collection of stories. Padma also translated the novel Saint Bernardo by the late lauded Brazilian novelist Graciliano Ramos, which is forthcoming in 2019 from New York Review Books. Her primary current project is a nonfiction book provisionally titled Alias Delia George. Canadian by birth and temperament, Padma now resides in Fayetteville, Arkansas, and teaches fiction and creative writing at the University of Arkansas. She lives on Mount Sequoia with her husband, the poet and translator Jeffrey Brock, her children, her parents, and an ever-shifting array of animals. Snakes are often involved. I'll end with a memory from one of Padma's classes. Prose writers sometimes don't get enough credit for their affection for words, as if we're not also working with these tools day in and day out. Padma thought it unfair that poets always have poems memorized they can whip out at parties and social gatherings. Don't works of fiction have beautiful passages? Why doesn't anyone ever recite those? She had us memorize a piece of prose we particularly enjoyed to recite in class. I delivered the end of Joyce's The Dead, a friend the end of a Borges story. Padma, having required us to memorize a passage, participated herself. She memorized the end of Tobias Wolff's Bullet in the Brain, so fitting for the purpose of the exercise, as it depicts a man who, in his final moments of life, right before his synapses stop firing for the last time, doesn't remember his children or his wife, but a time when he was young and was first charmed by what language can do. By a surprising turn of phrase from a southern cousin, he says, "Short is the best position they is." I'll always remember the spirit behind the exercise, but also Padma reciting the end of that passage. They is, they is, they is. It's my great pleasure to introduce Padma Viswanathan. Thanks.
How touching. What a wonderful introduction. I still recite the end of that story to myself, sometimes walking around Fayetteville and, the shadows lengthen on the grass, the tethered dog barks at the flying ball. Time. It's another chorus in that story. We can still make time. Which is what fiction is all about, right? One of my profs once said that fiction is a time machine. I think that's the other reason I like the end of that piece, because it reminds us in so many ways about why we write and about the magic we're able to create sometimes in writing. Both, most often we experience it in reading, right? Sometimes in writing, certainly. I think that's often the motivation to write. Can everybody hear me okay? Am I aiming correctly? Okay. So yes, I would like, first of all, to read you a couple of short pieces from my last novel, The Ever After of Ashwin Rao. It was recently published on audible.com, actually, where you can hear an actor read it much better than I can, I think, especially because the narrator is an Indian man, Ashwin Rao, who's he's born in India and raised there, does training as a psychologist in Canada, goes back to India at a certain point to work, but then is brought back to Canada, brings himself back to Canada because he has a project. He wants to do a study of comparative grief on families who lost loved ones in an airline bombing. So this is a real-life airline bombing, and I won't tell you too much about it because I'm going to read you the portion of the novel in which some details are described. But you don't actually see Ashwin, your narrator, in either of the pieces I'm going to be reading to you because the novel has a story within a story. Ashwin speaks directly to you, but he tells you about another man, Saith, who he meets during that study. Saith is a physics professor in his 30s, I think, when the novel starts in 85. I'll read you a bit from 1985, the day he finds out about the bombing, and then another bit that happens about 19 years later. So as I said, he's a physics professor. He lives in a fictional town called Lohikarma, which I made up, but it shares a lot of its geography and also its characteristics, its nature, with the town Nelson, British Columbia, where I was born. So this is in Western Canada. Venkat is Saith's friend. I'm just giving you a little background before I start to read. Sita is Venkat's wife, so Saith is the man you're going to hear about. Venkat is his friend. Sita is Venkat's wife, and Sundar is their son. I think all of this is fairly clear. And so I'm going to read from, first of all, the day of the bombing and its immediate aftermath, when nobody knew exactly what had happened, nor even really suspected who ultimately was likely responsible. But when, despite this, Saith feels himself to be racially visible and vulnerable in a way that he doesn't usually have to think about. This various aspects of this change in the 20 years between this section of the book and the portions of the book that take place in the early 2000s. Okay, and I've condensed this from a couple of places in the novel. Sunday, June 23rd, 1985. Saith mowed the lawn as the morning turned hot. He retreated to his recliner until the phone interrupted his nap. When he picked up, he might have thought it would be one of the children asking to bring a friend for lunch. That part he didn't remember. He remembered the strangeness of the sound at the other end and repeating once, "Hello?" before making out what it was. Someone sobbing, but not one of his daughters, and his wife was at home. "What?" he asked. "Enide, what is it?" "It's gone down." Venkat's voice, or some version of it, crashed. And in Tamil, as he began to cry, "Ahyo, my son, Sita." Venkat's son and wife had left day before yesterday for India. They had driven to Vancouver, and their plane would have departed, last night? "I will be right there. Venkat? Venkat, I'm coming. Wait for me." There was no reply. The sobbing receded, as though Venkat had wandered away from the phone. Saith shouted for his wife, trusting that she was within earshot. She came running at the emotion in his voice, saw the phone off the hook. Horror filled her eyes, and Saith had to say, No, it's Sita and Sundar. Their plane has crashed." He saw two quick ripples, each effacing the expression that went before, relief that it was not one of their daughters, then horror again. 10 minutes later, he was in the car, his radio squawking. An Air India plane, which had left Vancouver Saturday afternoon, picking up more passengers in Toronto and Montreal before heading for Heathrow, had disappeared off Irish radar at 8:15 Irish time, a little after 7 GMT, round about midnight for Canadians. It had simply vanished. No panicked messages, no blinking diamond wandering off the screen. Even a plane that had passed through the same airspace shortly after saw nothing. In place of more than 300 people, the void. Lohikarma's chill, closed beauty spread below him. He drove down into it. He didn't think, as Venkat would, of course he would, that the Pakistanis were behind the bomb. That made no sense. White supremacists, that was Seth's guess. Lowlifes like the ones who had recently attacked a couple of Sikh kids in a Vancouver suburb. Surrey, was it? He held the wheel tightly as he passed the buttery, benign facades of the houses on these long, familiar streets, their inhabitants locked away in unconfessed, murderous fantasies. There was racism everywhere, wasn't there? It was just more elegantly masked in educated or moneyed circles, say the upper echelons of the university's administration. Seth pictured Harvard's Dean of Science. He wouldn't be one to bomb an airplane. He just wrinkled his nose in amusement at the curry smell coming off your suit and made his jokes and other derogations later when he was alone with his cronies, all of them pink, pink, pink with rosacea and drink. No, it would have been a mechanic, someone good with his hands, in the thrall of some evil mastermind. Venkat's front door was locked, and he didn't answer the bell. After several tries, Seth went around to the patio doors and peered in. Venkat was sitting on the floor in the family room, his back against the sofa, not crying after all, but staring, as though being spoken to by an authority expressing grave disappointment and possibly anger. His was the look of a man accepting judgment. Seth never saw such a look on his face again. The news was on, loud enough for Seth to hear it through the glass doors. He knocked twice, hard, before Venkat started and stood, let him in, and went to the kitchen where he opened the doors on a closet that would have been, for a Western family, the pantry. Here it was a shrine. The shelves had been removed and pictures of the gods hung on the walls. The accoutrements of prayer, beads, incense, holy ash, coconuts were strewn on and around a pretty column of a lotus that Sita had painted onto a board and lain on the closet floor. Pride of place was given to a large photo of Shivashakti, Venkat's guru, whose eyes crinkled humor and benevolence from beneath thick bangs. Venkat seated himself before his gods, crossing his legs and laying his wrists on his knees. Om. His voice, quavering but insistent, rose into the air. Seth turned off the TV. Practical matters, logistics, these were his ways of keeping chaos at bay. When he prayed, it was in the orderly, formal way he had been taught as a child. The beliefs he had formed then, vague and therefore unchallengeable, had changed little. Om. The immortal syllable expanded, bubble-like, to fill the room. Venkat began chanting the Gayatri mantra, his voice gaining sonority as he completed the first iteration, sounding markedly clearer as he began a second. Om Bhurbhuva Suvaha Tat Savitur Varenyam Bhargo Devasya Dhimahi Diyo Yona Prachodayat. Gayatri mantra, the sun invocation whispered into the ear of a Brahmin child at his second birth, the ceremonial induction into caste and scholarship. Seth had not heard it spoken aloud in years. He took his place by Venkat's side and began to chant with him, their distinct tenors blending and bringing back the lost years of priests fogged in aromatic smoke, of funerals, of weddings, of long dead fathers and grieving mothers left far behind. Om Bhurbhuva Suvaha Tat Savitur Varenyam. O universe, with your heaven, your earth, and all the unknowable, unseeable realms surrounding them, and oh, that sun, lost. The sun-filled mangoes, sun-baked streets, sunburnt skins, lost. But still we sit, as our fathers taught us, seeking illumination. Hear us, especially in this hour of need. We're opening ourselves to your radiance, God, with expectant and willing minds. The sound did not hide the void, but it filled it with a kind of light. Nothing that would stop you from falling, but maybe stop you from being so afraid. Venkat faltered. Felled, he told Seth, by a recollection of Sundar receiving his holy thread in Shivashaktipuram, the ashram his guru had founded in India. a Punal ceremony back home. Venkat was that kind of Hindu, full of orthodoxy and energy, sincere in devotion both to the old gods and to this new guru who had revivified and reinvented the ways Hindus practiced their faith, the ways they believed. He and Sita conducted a special ceremony on Sundar's birthday each year until he left for university. They conducted it at the Shiva Shakti Center downtown. Seth recalled the last one, Sundar's 17th perhaps. He had started shaving the peach fuzz from his cheeks and lips. It made him look younger. He had come to Seth for help around then. He wanted to go on a school ski trip, and he had a massive fight with Venkat over it. Seth talked to Venkat, who said that skiing was dangerous and that he had heard from a colleague about kids on such trips, drinking, doing drugs. Seth couldn't, in good conscience, push. Sundar stayed home. The episode now clouded Seth's consciousness in a single black burst. No start, no finish, self-contained and sodden with loss. Why not let Sundar go, be with his friends? So he might have drunk alcohol, maybe even been tempted into sex. But probably not. He was a sensible boy. You have to trust them at a certain point. He looked over at Venkat, who was swaying a little, at least in Seth's strained vision. He himself was only functioning for Venkat's sake. Otherwise, grief could have easily unhinged him. He resumed chanting, and Venkat, when he regained his breath, did too. A half hour later, the doorbell rang. It was a group of other Shiva Shakti devotees, mostly strangers to Seth, a mixture of whites and Indians. Venkat didn't rise, nor pause in his chanting. The devotees greeted Seth at the door with their customary phrase, Jai Shiva Shakti. What's wrong with them? He had joked to his wife once at an ashram event. They can't say hi? Here, they seemed to show, in contrast with what he had seen in devotional sessions, far less emotion than was appropriate. Moving with clear purpose toward the kitchen, they sat in a circle around Venkat and joined the chant. Then, as if they had received a cue from some distant conductor, all their eyes were shut. They began to sing together, a Shiva Shakti song. Its tune was one Seth knew well from the traditional repertoire, but just as Gandhi had rewritten religious lyrics to deliver pacifist messages, Shiva Shakti's people had turned songs for other gods into songs for him. Seth stood and watched them from the kitchen entrance. The devotees' faces radiated a confidence and certainty he had never felt. They had wordlessly enclosed Venkat in their protective circle. No sobbing, no chatter. It was as though each had carried here a piece of a one-person-sized geodesic dome, and they unanimously and simultaneously put their pieces in place with the first note of their song, enclosing Venkat with his grief, his regrets, his love and hate. They didn't pretend to share what he was feeling. They didn't try to relieve him. They just reminded him, as if by prescription, that there was something more. Something more. Seth stood on the outside, watching a moment longer, and then began to sing. So Seth ends up becoming a devotee of the same guru, Shiva Shakti, that Venkat follows. His wife and daughters are skeptical, but they accept this as something he apparently needs to do. Life moves on and things get better, as they tend to do, but then in 2004, Seth learned something about his guru that he'd rather not know. This can happen with religious leaders. And he suffers a crisis of faith. So he wants to get away from his family on this night. As I said, his wife and daughters don't believe in the teacher the way he does, and he is struggling with this. And so he gets in his car, right? That's what North Americans do when they're in crisis. He gets in his car and he starts driving. He just starts driving without destination, making bigger and bigger loops around the city and up into the mountains that surround his home. And so in BC is all very mountainous, so he just drives up, okay? And he's thinking about what has happened. The goal is not the goal. Strive to cease striving. He'd always liked the sound of that. Strive to cease striving. Drive to cease driving. His accelerator felt loose. It seemed he was on a logging road. A couple of ruts through the trees, scrubby grass between them, made for and by jeeps and trucks. How long had the gas indicator light been on? It was hard to see in daylight, but all too visible in the off-road shade. He remembered now that he had meant to fill up that morning. The car rolled to a halt as the motor died into the silence of the vast Canadian winter. After yesterday's warm spell, the temperature was dropping again. He always overheated the car. It began cooling quickly now in the evergreen shade. He was wearing gloves and a winter coat, but had forgotten his hat and scarf, thin socks, Oxfords, with thick rubber soles so he wouldn't fall, but he still could freeze. What could he do? He had to walk. Where? He got out of the car and regretted it as the cold clapped his cheeks and boxed his ears, which started ringing again. Panic. Where the hell was he, and which way should he go? He turned toward the nose of the car, pointing deeper into the woods. How far would he have gone if he'd had more gas? How far would a full tank have taken him? Maybe it was a blessing. Maybe he was closer to civilization than he otherwise would have been. And still, it was only mid-afternoon. Winter, though. Only a few hours until sunset. The road curved off ahead and disappeared, nothing familiar about it, and there was little chance of finding anyone at the end of it who could help. He started to retrace his way. How long had it been since he had passed a house or any place that looked vaguely tended? How long had he been driving? He looked at his watch. 3 o'clock. What time had he left home? His coat was bulky and inelegant, with sturdy snaps and zippers. It looked as though it were made for this weather, and it had served him well from home to car to office, but now he felt the difference between it and its more expensive counterparts. A hood, for one thing. He pulled the puffy collar up close to his ears. He balanced among the heavy truck treads, fossilized in the frozen mud, stiff as the soles of his shoes. Glancing behind, he found his car had already disappeared. Progress. The trees around him were not huge, but they were indistinguishable. He presumed his car was still back there. His eyes stung. It wasn't that cold. Maybe a couple degrees below freezing, no wind. Why were his eyes watering? Not that cold compared to what? Compared to most of Canada. He was thinking fast, but it wasn't helping him. Mind racing, car stalled. Sounded like a fortune cookie. Fate, don't fail me now. Cold hands, warm heart. What was he supposed to do? Pray? Ha again. The trees were different now. Everything changes. They weren't all evergreens anymore. Birches, he thought, bent to left and right. Frost. Last thing he needed was more frost. What about a poem called Nice Warm Fire? Or a gas station. Again. More light coming through. His daughters had told him about this, how trees tell you the age of the woods, back when they were out in the woods together. Not often. Long, long ago. Evergreen woods are older, straighter, darker trees. He thought so, anyway. Younger woods let in more light. It was warmer. By a tint, he could feel it, splashes of sun on his face. Younger woods, more recently cleared. Old growth long gone. Old farms grown over. Or land cleared for some other reason. Or land where no trees had grown before. Now there were almost no evergreens, and he was walking fast and faster. He was almost warm. Why the sudden sense of optimism? He could still be miles from anyone who could help. Any second now he would trip over the body of the last guy abandoned by God in the middle of a crisis. It probably happened all the time. His eyes were still watering. His cheeks were wet. The woods thinned. He was at a crossroads. The road he had climbed, he only now noticed that he had been walking uphill, plateaued and continued through the intersection and beyond, flatter now, no longer an undulation underfoot. It stretched ahead, as far as Saith could see, toward a vanishing point. But what if it actually vanished at that point? It looked so unused that he could easily imagine it terminating in a field, thinning and running aground, sliding under the floating wreck of a pioneer cabin. You still saw them sometimes, roof beams rotted and caved, mysterious holes in the log walls. He imagined taking that road and living out his days in the ghost cabin, combing wheat seeds out of hulls with his teeth and chewing them raw, drinking the nectar of wildflowers, beard long and soft across his naked chest as he trance-huddled against the one standing wall of his shelter. But what if he couldn't grow a long beard? He had never tried. The crossing road delineated a wilder from a tamer place, woods from field, overgrown from overcleared. 2 roads diverged in a wood. He had walked out of the wild and had to choose, walk into the tame or take the road that straddled these ways of being. Way leads on to way. To his left, west. He took a couple of experimental steps, shoes crunching gravel, and it felt so good he kept going uphill and down dale until he came to the ocean, and kept going and discovered he could breathe underwater. He had simply never tried. Perhaps it only worked in salt water. Sundar and Sita were there. The water had pieced them back together, and there they lived, swimming with the fishes. Sita couldn't swim before, but necessity is the mother of mothers. Then there was the appeal of the East. He looked back over his shoulder at it, the vast expanse of where he came from. He jumped and was pulled back, their legs and arms flung from the force of the vortex that funneled along the road, the widening gyre. He spun, he tumbled, he flew, miming in reverse the actions that had brought him to the crossroads till he was shocked back into the darkness of the womb. East or west, it was his choice. But he always chose badly. He was not trained for choice. He didn't like it. The only things that made sense in his life were the things he had not chosen. His wife, his kids, his nations, his job. His guru? Was that a choice? Or had his guru chosen him? It felt as though Seth had chosen freely. He had overcome the resistance of his wife and kids to do it. Had he chosen badly? His department chose his courses. His students chose him. His parents chose his wife. When they went to a restaurant, his wife's food was always better unless he let her order for him. He could always be happy with a choice someone else had made. He should not be given such a responsibility as this. He turned to face each direction one more time. Sorry, I could not travel both and be one traveler. He sank to his knees and wept at the crossroads. He wept and could not choose and could not move. Now there's a little break in the chapter. Sir, the man's voice, uneasy. Could you stand, please? Slowly. What you feel is a gun in your back. No sudden moves. Seth continued to kneel, looking down at the mixed dirt and gravel where the roads entwined, and saw boots, brown hiking boots, to one side. Beyond them, if he shot his eyes as far to the side as they would go without turning his head, he could see the tires of a truck resting quite ordinarily on the western road. He became aware, as he had been so politely informed he might, of an iron nubbin of pressure on the bend of his spine. He took his hands off his chest, slowly put them to his thighs, and then pressed his fingertips to the chapped skin of the winter ground as he tried to straighten his legs. One didn't work. He tried the other. That one failed as well, and he fell over. Damn! This voice was different from the other and came from behind him. Pat him down. Seth, on his side on the sloping ground, shook his feet to try to get the feeling back into them and his legs. As the tingle started, so did the fear. He looked up at the first man who had spoken to him, a man in a ski jacket and a nylon balaclava. And that's where we're going to leave Seth for now. So you can check that part quickly in the book if you want to find out who those guys are and what kind of trouble he's gotten himself into on his spiritual quest. So I wrote that novel some years ago, and although, as Scott mentioned, I've been writing short fiction in the meantime and translating, and am quite deep in the middle of a nonfiction book, I admit that I have also started a novel, which I'm going to just read you a tiny bit from if you can switch gears. I'm just going to read you the opening so that you have a sense sort of both what my last big fiction project was and now what my next big fiction project is likely to be. So this novel is lighter. It's called A Light Here Required a Shadow There, which is a line some of you might recognize from Virginia Woolf's novel To the Lighthouse. The novel is about a mixed-race Indian child adopted into a biracial family in Canada, where the mother's from England and the father is from India, and they live in Western Canada. The novel starts in the 70s in this suburb in Alberta, which is where I ended up growing up. I think many fictional depictions of the immigrants in between world tend to contrast the social integration that even an economically disadvantaged immigrant might enjoy in his home country against the strangeness of a new land. But this boy, Arjun, his appearance is racially ambiguous, and so he can't really fool himself that he would belong anywhere. He does feel estranged in this very white suburb where he's growing up, but it would be just as bad had he remained in India, where he was born. So, and the novel is also a sort of a serio-comic response to a number of other books. I already mentioned the reference in the title, but the opening page can be read directly against Virginia Woolf's novel Orlando, just in the way that another book that inspired this one, Jeff Dyer's Jeff in Venice, Death in Varanasi, that opening page can be read directly against Death in Venice by coincidence. I didn't remember that encounter, actually, but I would love to kind of recreate where that conversation might have gone. The book has what I'm calling a butterfly structure. So it has a long first and third part with a very slim hinge. That first part takes place in Canada, the little slim center section in Venice, and the third part in South India. And the third part is also going to include a number of retellings of 3 key South Indian myths, tales, including one that Thomas Mann retold as a story called The Transposed Heads, which literally it's a story about it's also the founding myth of my mother's hometown's temple, in which 2 women, one high caste, one low caste, their heads get switched, and 2 avenging goddesses emerge out of this story. So that's sort of the background to it. But I'll just read you the first 5 pages or so. Okay. Is everything still good with this volume? Okay, good. He, for there could be no doubt of his sex, though the purple silk kimono he was wearing did something to disguise it, was in the act of slicing at his own head in a gilt-framed full-length mirror. It hung on the wall of his gigantic suburban basement. I should mention, by the way, that this section is subheaded 9 years. So you're meeting Arjun at 9. Let me start again. He, for there could be no doubt of his sex, though the purple silk kimono he was wearing did something to disguise it, was in the act of slicing at his own head in a gilt-framed, full-length mirror. It hung on the wall of his gigantic suburban basement. Arjun's mother had collected many mirrors from many antique stores, many garage sales, bringing them back to hang on their walls, each one made for her only son, a companion of some imagined kind. Now his nemesis grinned at him through greasy red lips, triumphantly, or so he thought. The gray cranes on the purple silk moved perpetually, ducking behind white bamboo stalks with each lunge and plunge and slice of the umbrella that served as Arjun's samurai sword. His small, stiff pompadour pleased him, but the black magic marker on his eyes made him look more Egyptian than Oriental, and he was starting to perspire into his powdery white face. He was standing in a yellow pool of low sun, the last firing of a prairie sunset. He climbed onto the sofa beneath the window to put his hand against the glass, to see it glow red from its own hot blood, his face now mercifully in cool shadow. Emitting his best Japanese warrior yodel, he leapt off the sofa to finish the duel. He had seen the Mikado that day, under the fluorescent lights in his school gym. The production struck him as silly and inadequate, and yet also as the best 3 hours of his entire 4th grade year. It might have been improved, he thought, by a fight scene. Arjun, by the looks of him, was cut precisely for some such victory. Turning now from his foe's final humiliation, he gave the umbrella a swish and opened it. Mincing back and forth, twirling the umbrella, petunia-patterned, his mother's, he tittered bits from 3 little maids from school or we. He didn't hear his father descending the carpeted stairs. Neither parent ever looked for him in the basement. They shouted from the top if they wanted him. "What were you doing down there?" they often asked. "I had to call 3 times." But such questions did not require answers. Arjun, swinging the umbrella off his shoulder to point it at the mirror, caught his father's eye above its twirling edge, his father watching him from the family room doorway behind him. "Hi," said Arjun. "Can you come upstairs?" His father broke eye contact and turned away. "Mama and I want to tell you something." Arjun followed him. The umbrella caught on the entrance to the stairs. He stepped on the kimono and had to catch himself when he fell, bending one of the umbrella tines, even as the cushion he'd tied onto his back fell back down the stairs. He stopped then, closed the umbrella, took off his mother's kimono, left it all in a heap, and still, when he arrived in the living room where his parents sat silently waiting, his mother looked at him with an expression he read as dismay and told him to wash his face, please. The crusting baby powder came off right away, as did all but faint traces of the magic marker on his mouth and eyes, but Vaseline is hard to get out of your hair, as he already knew from his Elvis phase. His parents were chatting quietly by the time he returned to perch on the sofa beside his mum. His father sat in the easy chair. This name had always intrigued Arjun. When a particularly large guest collapsed in it, Arjun imagined the chair saying, "Whoa there, easy, easy boy." "Come sit a little closer to me, Arjun." His mother patted the spot next to her, and when he slid over, scratched his back and tucked her arm around his waist. His father smiled at him a little, then looked at his mother, but when Arjun looked at her, she was looking back at his dad with her eyebrows raised. Something was happening here. "Arjun, you might have heard us talking about going to India this summer." His father leaned forward a little. "We've booked the flights. It's going to be fun." That plastic smile again. But then he leaned back. "We need to talk to you about something else." Arjun's mother's hand tightened a little on his waist. He sat with his own hands on his knees as though they were sweating, felt the powder tightening at his hairline, recalled his father's look in the mirror, his father looking at him from behind before he knew Arjun could see him. There was something terrible in that look, something routine, ever present, but with its mask relaxed, as though wearing it tired his father, and he was taking a little break. "Am I adopted?" Arjun asked. He had asked it before when he was very small, before he knew what it meant. Someone had teased him. "No," his mother had said, gathering him into the warm wool of her sweater. "No, no, no." This time, his father's face went slack, his mother gasped, and the band of her arm tightened around his waist. Or, "We need to talk to you about something else," said his father. "Yes, dear," his mother squeezed him, "about how you came into our lives." "I sort of know about that stuff already," Arjun mumbled toward his hands, which were now sweating properly on his knees. "What do you mean?" his father asked, a little sharply. "The school nurse did a presentation in the library about where babies came from, but Damien had sort of told me about it already." He glanced up at his father. "Oh," his mother laughed beside him in a gasping sort of way. "Oh, what a little man you are now." "Yes, well, that's good," said his father, the doctor. "But after your sister, after giving birth the first time, your mother, she was not able to give birth to any more babies, you see?" "But," Arjun was struggling, "you had me." He looked at his mother, who was biting her lip. "Who gave birth to me?" Or, "We need to talk to you about something else," said his father. He looked at his wife, so Arjun did too. Then Arjun looked back at his father, who continued to speak. "It wasn't important to tell you before. You are our son, of course, and nothing changes that." His mother's arm was uncomfortably tight, jammed up under his ribcage. "But we must tell you where you came from. Also because in India, one of your relatives might—" "Where I came from?" Arjun asked. "Didn't I come from the same place as you?" In later years, he would recall all three scenes, tell all three, never settling on one, not even for himself or for his wife, the only person to whom he confessed that the versions were co-equal in his mind. "You were adopted," said his father. "We adopted you," said his mother, "from an orphanage in Madras, close to where Appa is from, although it looked to us as though, well, you looked like you could be our child. You are our child." She hugged him then, looking into his face and wiping away a tear. "You are our son, all right?" "You mean like my skin color and stuff?" "Yes, but it wasn't just that. You pulled us to you. Arjun, I couldn't have any more babies after your sister. We waited a long time and then went back to India to find a child, and there you were, our baby. But whose was I before?" His mother looked at his father, who said, "There are no records. All the nuns could tell us was that you were a miracle. You were rescued from a car crash. I was born in India? It says that on your passport," said his father, "just like on mine. Can I see it?" "Of course, dear." His mother unwound herself from him and went to the kitchen, returning with 2 passports. The Indian one had a trio of stylized lions sitting back to back on its cover. The one facing him looked neutral, even friendly, but the two behind it bared their teeth to east and west. His picture showed a scrawny, pale baby with a stripe of black hair, a stranger to Arjun. The front of the Canadian passport was much more decorative and complicated, with flags, a crest, mythical creatures, and a fancy crown floating above it all. Arjun had been photographed for it just a few months ago, but here too, when he opened it, the picture showed a stranger, a child who resembled him, but who lived in some looking-glass world with different parents and friends and music, with some different history and future. His mother had read him the Alice books a few years ago, and for months after, the full-length mirror in the hallway nook where he dressed in the morning, a comforting ritual whose origins were obscure and which he now realized was perhaps set to expire, had contained another child, Nudra, one who looked much like Arjun, but who glared at him resentfully or else ignored him. And Nudra is just Arjun spelled backward. In Nudra's house, there was no warm brown smell of buttered toast and sausages, no 6:30 Ched playing Foreigner and Crystal Gale, Don't It Make My Brown Eyes Blue. Rather, Nudra dressed in silence, in stale and chilly air before going out to forage for his daily pittance. Like Oliver in the TV movie, he would stand in line somewhere and wait for a fist-sized mass of congealed gruel to drop impersonally into a bowl he held. His mouth watered as he waited, his knobby knees clattered together when the gruel landed. Nudra, unlike Arjun, didn't get foil stars on his math tests. His car didn't lead the spelling train at the front of a well-lighted classroom. No one picked on him for being smart and strange and small and brown. No one called him Packy or threatened to beat him up unless he turned over his Halloween candy. Nudra owned the streets. His wit was quick and cruel, and he looked like many, many other kids in that other world. So that's the opening of that book.